Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on globalization and crime, focusing on types of global crime. Globalization describes the greater interconnectedness of nations in contemporary society. In other words, the coming together of nations to form a global society. And while this has many benefits such as greater freedom of movement, giving us the ability to work, travel and be influenced by other nations and cultures, it also has increased the volume and types of crime that we experience in contemporary society. In this video, we're going to outline some of the ways in which globalization has led to a change in the types of crime that are committed. Globalization has changed society in many ways, and some of the features of globalization have led to changes in the types of crime that are committed. In the era of globalization, we have witnessed increased travel, in part due to decrease in airfares, but also due to global tourism. We've also had the growth of communications networks, in particular the internet, which allows us to access other parts of the world almost instantly. With globalization and in particular the fall of communism, the spread of capitalist ideology has grown with the ability to purchase and sell goods across the planet, which in turn has led to the growth of transnational companies and also income inequality. There has also been a growth of international media, and with this an accusation of cultural imperialism that has led to threats to national security, in part due to the increased freedom of movement. All of these are connected, much like society, and have resulted in new forms of crime emerging. Some examples of the types of crime that have been created by globalization are listed here, and we'll look at each of these individually and how globalization has caused these. As part of the AQA specification, we also need to look in more depth at the research into these areas, and we will do so in future videos. But for now, globalization has increased the amounts of the following crimes: trafficking of weapons, people, drugs and counterfeit goods, amongst other things. It's also seen the growth of organised crime syndicates, particularly from the former Soviet Union. Corporate crime and green crime have increased, with often corporations being responsible for damage to the environment. Cybercrime has grown, particularly with the growth of the internet, making it easier to steal somebody's life savings from the other side of the world than it is to steal somebody's wallet in the street. And finally, state crimes and human rights violations. Whilst these are not new forms of crime, particularly for the colonial powers, our awareness of these and human rights violations has grown due to the growth of the media. If we start with trafficking. Now, trafficking is the illegal transport of goods and people across international borders. With globalization, this has been made easier due to international agreements between nations over freedom of movement, for example, the EU. Another factor in trafficking has been the fall of communism and how nationals of former Soviet nations can now move freely out of the countries that they lived in. This has meant greater movement of arms and drugs from Asian countries such as Afghanistan, one of the world's largest exporters of opium, into Europe, and from former Soviet states into Africa, where arms are trafficked to local militias. A third factor in this is the increase in international travel, which makes it more difficult to monitor people coming into and out of countries, particularly with the lack of investment into border patrols by nations operating neoliberal economic policies. Now, much of this trafficking is carried out by organised crime syndicates, and the growth of organised crime, particularly in former Soviet states. The collapse of communism led to a reduction in the recruitment and retention of covert operatives that have been used throughout much of the Cold War. Spies and former Secret Service agents, for example the KGB, were no longer employed by the state. As a consequence, their skills were acquired by privatised militias, often operating illegally in the aftermath of the fall of communism, snatching up former military equipment and utilising connections to move people, goods and money into Europe. These McMafias, as Glennie called them, became synonymous with organised crime. They had the resources, contacts and skills to create global criminal networks, and they utilised these to set up operations across Europe, Africa and the US. A further impact of globalization has been the deregulation of markets and the growth of free trade, and this has resulted in the growth of transnational corporations. These corporations have used globalization to facilitate the movement of their production to low-wage economies, but this has also meant less scrutiny over their business practices. Moving to lower wage economies allows them to produce their goods for much cheaper than Western nations, but this comes at a price to those nations that allow them to set up production. A lack of employment legislation is one incentive for TNCs to move, but health and safety concerns and environmental issues have arisen as TNCs grow. This is seen as an increase in corporate crime and links into our next form of crime, green crime. Now, green crime is not always defined as being illegal, but can be defined as being damage to the environment. Examples of green crimes include air and water pollution, deforestation, desertification, and species extinction, and this has increased as transnational corporations spread production further away from consumers. Other impacts of globalisation, such as increased air travel and industrialisation of the newly developing world, have led to record levels of CO2 emissions and plunged society to the brink of a global climate crisis. Furthermore, as levels of consumption spread with the growth of TNCs and capitalism, this has led to a decline in natural resources and calls for the implementation of Green New Deals around the globe. However, despite these calls, corporations continue to use finite resources rather than focusing on sustainability and using renewable sources of energy. The growth of internet and mobile technologies has led to an increase in the amount of cybercrime, which did exist prior to globalisation, but on a much smaller scale. The internet has accelerated the connectivity between nations and allowed for greater movement of money globally, but it's also allowed people to gain access to others' personal data. Incidents of cyber fraud, cyber trespass or hacking, and cyberbullying and extortion have risen dramatically in recent years. The use of data has even been suggested to have manipulated the outcomes of elections and the Brexit referendum, which illustrates one of the dangers of being dependent upon the internet for information. And finally, state crimes. State crimes are not new. They have existed for many hundreds of years, and one only has to look in the history books to see that governments and monarchs have acted illegally against their own citizens on many occasions. However, globalisation has increased our awareness of state crimes and human rights violations through the media. We become aware of crimes committed by the state against its own people rapidly, such as the Rwandan genocide, Syria, Iraq, Myanmar, and many others. Globalisation and the growth of the internet has also allowed us to find out about state crimes that have been carried out in secret, such as the WikiLeaks scandals of this century. Globalised financing is also behind many of these state crimes, and the funding of militias by governments to try and overthrow other leaders is an example of how one state can covertly influence the politics of another. The influence of cultural globalisation has also led to resistance in the form of terrorism, which has increased in the post-globalisation era, although it certainly is not new. It's often state-sponsored and a response to the cultural and economic globalisation of non-Western nations. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on globalisation and crime, focusing on types of global crime. Thanks for watching.